Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I want to take you to Louisiana in 1863, where the Union Army is occupying a vast amount of territory in the state of Louisiana, which is in rebellion to the United States. In the Union occupied areas, uncounted numbers of displaced people, enslaved people who have fled plantations from around the area, around the South and the Southwest and the Southeast, and made their way to Louisiana. It's no surprise that the New Orleans area is a heavy recruitment area for Union soldiers following the Emancipation Proclamation, even before that time, before the Emancipation Proclamation was released, there were Black men in blue. So, in that group of Union soldiers that were in Louisiana at that time is the man pictured here. His name is George Hepworth, and he's a Massachusetts man, strong abolitionist, reverend in Boston, comes down to Louisiana with the 47th Massachusetts Infantry, joins the staff of Nathaniel Prentice Banks, who is the commander of the Department of the Gulf, and Hepworth is assigned the task of interviewing plantation owners and enslaved people who have made their way to freedom. I want to share one of the poignant, vivid, and horrible stories of one of the enslaved men who made his way to freedom and was interviewed by Chaplain Hepworth. The man's name is October. I do not have a photograph of him. We only have his name and his story. He was in Arkansas on a plantation and escaped to freedom. Hepworth interviewed October and told his story in a book that he wrote in 1863. So I want to read the story to you because it is so vivid and so much captures the treatment of enslaved people and how inspired they were by Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Union Army to get away from those who held them in bondage and find freedom. October did it at an enormous cost. So let me get into a story. This is, again, Chaplain Hepworth, who is writing this passage. And he says, October was a slave on a large cotton plantation in the southern part of Arkansas. When 20 years of age, he had married a yellow girl. Now, that's 19th century language for someone, a woman who would have been of a biracial situation, which would likely have meant a white plantation owner and one of his slaves. A yellow girl in the plantation by whom he, October, was blessed with one child. He said he had always been a restless hand and entertained an instinctive hatred towards the overseer. He could never understand why that brutal man, the overseer, should stand over him with a whip and, whenever he felt a little out of sorts, have the right to vent his spleen by a sharp cut over October's shoulders. To be sure, the overseer was white, and he had been told that white people had received the power from God to do their will with the blacks. That these blacks were not regarded by God as good for much, that some of them had souls, those who worked faithfully, and some were no better than pigs that fed them from the master's bounty. This, he said, could never be comprehended. October lay awake many a night thinking about it. He talked the matter over with his wife, but neither of them could understand it being how some people could have a soul and others could not. October only knew one thing, that he hated the whole white race, and that, above all things else, he hated and cursed God because God had apparently said that some don't have souls, some do. When he was well nigh worn out by these thoughts, an old gray headed preacher from the next plantation came into October's cabin and, being a very sympathetic man, got October's whole story out of him. When he had told all, the old man hid his face in his hands and murmured, "How long, O good Lord? How long?" Then, turning to October, he put his hand on his shoulder and said impressively, "October, the white man is a liar, and the Lord tell the truth. We are a poor, miserable race, but God Almighty loves us just as much as he do the rich white folks." From that moment, said October, I knew what I wanted. I was to be free. I wanted freedom. The next morning, with a lighter heart, he, October, went into the field, and when he came home at the accustomed hour for dinner, his wife and child were gone. There was the pork all cut up and ready to be fried, and down on the hearth in the pan was the corn dough. No fire on the hearth, and, he said, a feeling in the room that made me sit down in a chair and cry like a baby. Just then, the overseer appeared at the door. "Where's my wife and baby?" October cried frantically. "What, October? Do you mean Mary and the pickaninny? Why, the old man was dunned most awfully this morning." Dunned being a 19th century word for repeatedly wanting payback. And, Hepworth continues, knowing that you and your woman were a damned uneasy couple, he just slipped the other two away. October went crazy. The nearest thing at hand was an iron pan with the corn dough in it. Quick as thought, October shied it at the overseer's head. It just missed him, but October saw at once that he had committed a crime which would be considered heinous by any slave jury. And for all practical purposes, October was a dead man at that moment. Hepworth continues, October then started for the swamp, while the enraged overseer went for his gun and dogs. October had no food except for 3 slices of pork, which he had slipped into his pocket, and no clothing except for what he had on his back. He had a fearful task before him, but his agony fitted him for it. With wonderful speed, he rushed through the swamp till he came to a small bayou. This was fortunate, for the dogs would here lose his track. He swam across and kept on the full run for half an hour, when the baying of the head hound proved that he was seen. On he went, and on the dog came. He had no weapon save a dull jackknife, which he opened and got ready for use. The head dog was on him, his sharp teeth were in his thigh, and the other dogs, 4 in all, were not far in the rear. With a great effort, he managed to get hold of the dog's throat with his left hand, and with his right brought down the old jackknife blade just back of the skull of the hound. It was a lucky hit, for the dog let go his hold and fell dead. He then, October, limped on as fast as he could, and coming across a thick club, he grasped it, resolving to die game. 2 of the hounds were near enough to see him. There was no use in running, so he stopped to gather strength and get breath for the contest. The hounds rushed on furiously. One made his leap and stunned him. The other dog fastened his teeth into the calf of October's leg and hung to him most savagely. October had lost his knife, and the club was of little use. He beat the brute as lustily as he could, but his blows did not drive him off. At last, he grew desperate. The overseer could not be far behind, and if he came up, all was lost. He went down on his knees and managed to get the hound by the throat. With both hands, he clinched him, and at last had the satisfaction of seeing that the brute was choking. Still, he held fast to his calf, and when he was choked dead, or rather senseless, so tenacious was the brute that October was compelled to pull his jaws apart to get free. He then started on, limping badly. Still, his trials were but just begun. He got rid of the dogs, but now he was to encounter men who were just as merciless. He had no food, and his feet were sore and badly cut. His clothes were torn nearly off his back, and as I think of the poor boy, worn with heavy grief, without a friend in the whole wide world, making his way through the dense jungle, and yet willingly enduring these things, and the simple hope of being the possessor of his own body, that's freedom, and of getting to some place where no man would have the right to sell from his home those whom God had given him. I feel that there is something heroic and manly in him. He has proved his worthiness to enjoy that inalienable right which should be the birthright of all. For 10 days, he wandered through the woods, traveling mostly by night, and at last, on a beautiful bright morning, he came out in the road and saw in the distance our flag floating in the breeze. Then, said October, I felt safe. I knew that the moment I got close to that flagpole, I was free. And yet, we have generals in our army, God grant we have none now, who would have forbidden that boy to come within our lines and have delivered him over to his master, had that master come with his oily, lying lips and stood upon his rights as a Southern gentleman. So there you have the brutal story of October escaping the overseer on the plantation on which he was held, his wife Mary and child having been taken away by the overseer who wanted repayment. We have no idea what happened to October. Did he become a soldier? More importantly, did he find his wife and child? Were they ever reunited? This remains a mystery. But we do know, thanks to Chaplain Hepworth, that October's story is preserved in a book and now to all of you who are listening. So thanks very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.